This week, Jews of color have spent years talking privately and publicly about the racism they face in the Jewish community, with their stories often ignored or actively disregarded. Now, a landmark study titled Beyond the Count backs those stories up with data. Let's dive in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. Before getting to data points like 80% of the Jews of color in this study saying they have experienced racism in Jewish settings, there's some background to know about the study itself. That background is hinted at in the title Beyond the Count: Perspectives and Lived Experiences of Jews of Color. This is the second major piece of research commissioned by the Jews of Color Initiative after Counting Inconsistencies, which analyzed 25 American Jewish population studies to figure out how many Jews of color there are in this country. The Jews of Color Initiative is an organization formed in 2018 to give grants to support Jews of color, do research, and educate the larger Jewish community on the needs of Jews of color. Counting Inconsistencies arrived at Jews of color being at least 12 to 15% of American Jewry, a very significant amount given that Jews of color have long been dismissed as being just a handful of people. Keep in mind also that demographic data from Jewish population studies also affects how communities and donors decide to spend money on Jewish engagement. So this wasn't just a, hey, we're here and we exist thing. It was a, you have to make sure you're actually catering to us as members of the community thing. But with this 12 to 15% range came controversy. Some significant Jewish demographic scholars went on record to dispute Counting Inconsistencies and said that Jews of color were in fact closer to 6% of the American Jewish population. And, well, we Jews are great at arguing, and in doing so, often missing the point of the larger conversation. So that's where this new study comes in, going for a perspective that is quite literally beyond the count and beyond the arguing over the count, instead getting at who Jews of color are and what they think in relation to themselves, their Judaism, and other Jews. What's really important to understand before getting to the numbers, though, is what this study is and what it is not. Most of us are used to demographic studies with representative samples, which means that the people surveyed represent, as accurately as possible, the larger population that is being studied, and the data is meant to reflect everybody. So, for example, if 10% of a representative sample of American Jews say they pick their nose, that means you can say with some confidence that 10% of all American Jews pick their nose. But this study, Beyond the Count, doesn't aim to be representative in that sense. This is a survey that was shared widely via Jewish organizations and on social media without trying to get a random sample that can accurately reflect on all Jews of color. For example, around 2/3 of the respondents are women, when you would expect a representative sample to have closer to a balance of 50-50 of men and women. Part of the reason for this, though, is that researchers don't actually know what a representative sample for Jews of color looks like. As the report says, quote, without more extensive demographic data about the larger population of Jews of color for context, it is not possible to confirm that the sample is representative, end quote. The study was also built around an opt-in model, so all questions were optional, and if someone didn't want to answer, they didn't. That means that though there are overall 1,118 respondents, different questions actually have a different number of respondents, though most still had around 1,000 people answer. 61 Jews of color were also interviewed outside of the survey for more in-depth thoughts. But here's the thing, even though the results of this study aren't directly statistically representative of all Jews of color, this is still a massive survey of over 1,000 Jews of color and what they think and what they've been through, so this is still a lot of data that shows very real trends and should spark a lot of food for thought. So let's finally get to the data, starting with Jews of color. Who is that, and what does that term actually mean? Well, out of the respondents to this study, 2/3 identify as biracial, mixed, or multiracial. 21% are Black or African American, 10% are Hispanic or Latino, another 10% are Asian, and 7% are Middle Eastern or North African. 2/3 were raised Jewish, while the other third converted. 2/3 are women, while roughly 23% are men, and another 9% are non-binary, two-spirit, third gender, or another gender. 5% are transgender, and 14% have a disability. So those are a lot of numbers, but what they point to is the fact that this umbrella term, Jews of color, is very multifaceted. A lot of very different Jews with very different backgrounds are being lumped together under this term, which is complicated. Respondents were asked what they think of the term Jews of color, and some of their responses were quoted as part of this study. For example, a Black and Latino man in his 30s said, quote, "People of color and Jew of color are uselessly broad terms to combine completely unrelated experiences. I am an Afro-Latino convert, and my experience is vastly and fundamentally different from a Mizrahi Jew, yet we're collapsed into the same category." End quote. A Black multiracial woman in her 40s said, quote, "I am just a Jew and I don't feel like I should need an adjective to define it any more than white people do. Are whites Jews of whiteness? Of course not, because they're white so people just accept it. But because my skin color isn't white, I'm something other than just a Jew." End quote. There's a kind of dilemma when it comes to using this term, and the researchers of this study recognize that as they write that Jews of color, quote, "is understood as an imperfect but useful umbrella term," end quote. And just as an aside, here's what that makes me think about. This observation about the term Jews of color is something many Jewish organizations should probably take note of. It's one thing to cater almost abstractly to Jews of color, and another thing to really know who is in your community and how they need and or want to be supported as Jews. And look, there's always this tension in Jewish organizations and synagogues between the effort it takes to cater individually to each family or person and a sometimes easier, sort of more blanket approach to the entire community. But blanket approaches to engaging Jews of color runs the risk not only of failing because of poor planning, but it also runs the risk of making more Jews feel like outsiders in their own community, if their own community only feels like engaging them as part of a lumped general category that these Jews may not feel they fit in. And at the same time, there are real issues with diversity and equity in the Jewish community that this term, Jews of color, helps us see, for example, by giving a useful framework to get the results of this study. And on that note, let's get back to some of the data from this study about racism and discrimination. 75% of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed that in Jewish environments, others have made assumptions about them based on their skin tone. Those assumptions range from these Jews being security guards at the synagogue, or uneducated converts, or not actually Jewish, which leads to 74% of respondents agreeing they have felt burdened with explaining themselves and their identity, and 66% saying they've been asked questions about their race or ethnicity that made them uncomfortable. Only 20% of the respondents to this study have not experienced discrimination in a Jewish environment. One African-American and Cherokee woman in her 40s said, quote, "When I was doing Jewish leadership training, there was this guy who asked me twice if I could get him something, and I told him, I don't work here, I'm attending. And 20 minutes later, he asked me the same question, and I told him to stop and really look at me because this is the second and last time I'm saying this. I'm here, I'm a participant, I'm a Jew." End quote. So it's no surprise that respondents have some sharp feedback to give about how Jewish institutions and communal leaders overall are handling issues of diversity. 65% of the Jews of color surveyed say that Jewish leaders are poorly or very poorly addressing the specific needs of Jews of color. Jewish leaders are doing just as bad at addressing the need for greater racial and ethnic diversity in leadership itself. And while a little over half of respondents agree that Jewish leaders are doing a fairly well or very well job of addressing racism outside of the Jewish community, the same amount say that leaders are doing a poor or very poor job of addressing racism inside the Jewish community. Now, where do we go from here with this data? Researchers have some recommendations as part of the study. Number one, support organizations and initiatives led by and serving Jews of color. Number two, shift organizational leadership to more accurately reflect the diversity of American Jews. Number 3, prioritize creating spaces and places for discourse and dialogue with and among Jews of color. Number 4, promote further research by and about Jews of color. There's obviously a lot to talk about with each of those recommendations, but for this episode, I want to end with a focus on number 3, creating spaces for Jews of color, because this study has some interesting thoughts to offer specifically on that. Because here's the thing, despite all of the racism, roughly half of the respondents said that they have felt a sense of belonging among white Jews. But the Jews of color surveyed also said that they felt more connection with other Jews of color than white Jews. And that's not in any way surprising. People like being in environments where they don't have to exhaustively explain themselves to be accepted. So, 46% of respondents said that talking about the Jews of color experience with other Jews of color is very important. But the spin on this is that over a third also say they have no friends who are Jews of color. So researchers concluded that these kinds of spaces are unavailable to many, which really is a shame. In relation to this, an Asian and white mixed woman in her 20s said, quote, "I don't think it can be overstated the alienation and potential for disconnect for young people of color who grow up in predominantly white Jewish communities, especially someone like myself who is mixed race and attended an Ashkenazi, majority white synagogue growing up. I never had Jews of color as role models growing up, and I didn't think it was possible to be non-white and Jewish. Only through my own journey have I met and been able to join other Jews of color in community and reclamation of Jewish practice and culture." End quote. The need to face these issues in the American Jewish community is only increasing as time goes on. According to the 2020 census, the United States is getting more diverse, and there's really no reason to think the Jewish community is any different. Ilana Kaufman, executive director of the Jews of Color Initiative, which commissioned this study, wrote in a JTA op-ed that, quote, "For anyone who cares about sustaining and building a strong Jewish community, the data in Beyond the Count should be both concerning and energizing. Racism connected to our communal institutions and our individual actions has caused harm, and this harm has sometimes pushed away Jews of color and detached them from Jewish identity, from Jewish community, and ultimately from what should be an unobstructed pathway to Torah." End quote. So there's a lot to chew on here, but there is yet more in the study itself that I have not covered in this episode, so I invite you to go and read it. Links to the study, Kaufman's op-ed, and other reporting on Beyond the Count from JTA, The Forward, and the Jewish News of Northern California are available in the podcast notes. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes.